All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Washington, D.C. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Did that work out? Everyone can see my slide there?
It looks great.
Super. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Katie Brown. I am the Director of Professional Learning at the National Center for Montessori in the Public Sector. I would like to take a few minutes today to talk a little bit about Montessori education research and racial justice in the context of moving conversations from the margins to the mainstream. And I am going to ask your understanding, as I am afraid that I am literally working on breathing, as I'm 8 months pregnant and this child is occupying all of the space where my lungs used to be. So if I have to pause to catch my breath periodically, please bear with me. I, like Dr. Lee, am not a Montessorian by training. My background is in traditional education. I taught middle and high school language arts and first came to Montessori when I went to work in state level administration in South Carolina. And that experience was formative for me in two ways. First, working at the state level enabled me to see that some of the racial disparities that I had previously experienced and witnessed at the classroom and school level were not just about my classroom and not just about my school. These were, in fact, structural and systemic inequities at work. And secondly, when I went into public Montessori classrooms and was able to witness Montessori pedagogy at work, I was seeing a powerful and liberatory alternative to what I had previously known schooling could be. So these two sort of joint realizations prompted me to go and pursue a doctorate in urban education to study this structural and systemic inequity in American education and what Montessori might have to offer as we reimagine schooling. So just to tell you a little bit about the National Center for Montessori in the Public Sector, our mission is to help schools deliver high-quality personalized education through Montessori. We were originally founded in 2013 under the auspices of AMS and have been an independent nonprofit since 2015. Many folks outside of Montessori do not know this, but there are currently over 500 public schools offering Montessori programs. Those include charter schools, magnet schools, neighborhood schools, and schools in the school programs. So that is our focus, and I, as a researcher, am particularly interested in these public Montessori programs. I want to start with a brief story to illustrate kind of my point here. So one of my very first Montessori experiences when I first went to work at the State Department in South Carolina, about a month after I started working there, was to go to a Montessori conference. And I came and I was in my suit and I had my laptop and I walked into this session and the woman who was leading it lit a candle and we sat on the floor and she was ringing a bell and she had us sing. And I thought that I had wandered into an alien world. It was just totally foreign to me. And over the course of the weekend, I came to sort of understand the Montessori way a little bit better. But I tell this story to illustrate a challenge that I think has long plagued the Montessori community, and that is a strong insider-outsider dynamic. And so much of what we do in Montessori schools and classrooms is structurally and philosophically different from conventional education. We have these multi-age groupings, we have special teacher training, we teach writing before reading. We do a lot of these things differently. And so I think that sometimes that leads to us having conversations about the way we do it in Montessori to the exclusion of everyone else. And sometimes we think that the conversations that we're having are not necessarily relevant to the conversations that are going on in conventional education. So we effectively sort of marginalize our own dialogue. Questions like, how does racial bias show up in Montessori materials, I think are really important and really useful questions to ask. And what I'd like to do today is encourage us to think about how we can be a part of more mainstream conversations about racial justice and education in a way that both improves the Montessori movement and brings Montessori to bear on conventional education. So what I'd like to do is just briefly talk about one of my past studies as an example of how we might think about doing that. So when I went back to school to study urban education, I spent a lot of my time learning about the many, unfortunately, school-related outcomes with racial disparities. The one that we hear about a lot in the mainstream media or popular media is, of course, around academic opportunity and academic achievement. But one of the ones that I was really interested in studying was racial disparities in school discipline. The literature tells us that this is one of the major ways in which African American children in particular are harmed by schools, is by disproportionate rates of exclusionary school discipline. So in my work with public Montessori schools, I had seen how discipline, not a word that we use in Montessori very much, right? And classroom management looked very different in Montessori classrooms. In the Montessori classrooms I had seen, children had a lot more autonomy, they had more freedom of movement, they had individualized instruction targeting each child's interests. The teacher was working more as the guide on the side and less as the sage on the stage. All of these things led me to wonder, what does this phenomenon of racially disparate discipline look like in Montessori contexts? And so I collaborated with my colleague, Dr. Amy Steele, who you can see on the slide there, who was with me at UNC Charlotte at that time to try and answer this question. So our article was published in the inaugural issue of the Journal of Montessori Research. So if you are interested in looking it up after this talk, that's where you can find it. So the literature, we have over, at this point, over 45 years of research telling us that in public schools writ large, Black students are suspended out of school at rates 2 to 3 times higher than their white peers. This vast body of research tells us that this is not because Black students are misbehaving more. It also tells us that Black students are likely to receive harsher punishments than white students for the exact same offenses. Black students are more likely to be disciplined for offenses that might require more interpretation, more judgment on the part of the teacher, like defiance or disrespect, things that are a little bit more subjective. And this is where we see implicit bias coming into play, right? We know race to be the strongest non-behavioral predictor of suspension. And this is directly related to the phenomenon known as the school to prison pipeline, right? Suspension and expulsion are closely related to future interactions with the criminal justice system. And so this epidemic that we have in this country of the mass incarceration of Black and brown people actually starts in our K through 12 schools. And there's a good deal of evidence of this phenomenon happening even at the preschool level with children as young as 3 and 4. So given what we know about that phenomenon, Dr. Steele and I wanted to study what that looks like in Montessori schools. So we did this using a measure of discipline disproportionality called the relative rate index, which is essentially a ratio of the rate of out-of-school suspension for Black children in a given school or setting versus the rate of out-of-school suspension for white children. So for this study, we looked at a large urban district in the Southeast. The literature suggests that this phenomenon of discipline disproportionality is somewhat more pronounced in the South, so we wanted to take a look there. This was a district that had 3 large public Montessori schools that were sort of well established. And we selected a sample of 14 traditional schools that were within the same school district that had a comparable socioeconomic makeup. All of the schools in this study had a free and reduced lunch rate ranging from 0 to 20%. There's sort of some disagreement in the literature over how predictive the school socioeconomic level is of racial discipline disproportionality, but for the sake of argument, we wanted to control for that. So interestingly, we found that the overall rates of suspension didn't differ between Montessori and traditional schools. Out-of-school suspensions, these were elementary schools, happened at about the same rate in both contexts. In the Montessori schools, we found, and we just compared rates of out-of-school suspension for Black children as compared to those for white children. In the public Montessori schools included in the study, we found that Black children were suspended at rates 2.6 times higher than their white peers. So essentially, for every one white student who was suspended, 2.6 Black students received out-of-school suspension. This is about consistent with the national average, which again in the literature ranges from 2 to 3 times. When we looked at the comparable traditional schools, however, we found that the rate of suspensions for Black children in those schools was over 11 times higher than that of white students. This is one of the tables from the article. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through it, but if you actually dig into the data from those traditional schools, you'll see that the 11 times might actually be a little bit of a lowball estimate. So these findings, I would argue, my co-author and I argued, have implications both for the Montessori community and for the broader education community. So for those of us who live and work in Montessori, I think it's very important to recognize that we are not immune. This is a phenomenon that's happening in our schools and our classrooms as well, right? Racial discipline disproportionality in the Montessori schools in this study was on par with national averages. And I think that for the Montessori community, that prompts some additional questions, both for research and for practitioners, like what is the role of implicit bias in how Black children are experiencing public Montessori classrooms? Also, out-of-school suspensions don't come out of the blue, right? Usually they are the culmination of a disciplinary process. So the question there is what's happening leading up to these out-of-school suspensions and what do equitable school and classroom level discipline policies and procedures look like from Montessori schools? And lastly, thinking about teacher preparation, what is the role of Montessori training programs in disrupting this phenomenon? Thinking about the broader field and what this work might have to offer practitioners who are and researchers who are not in Montessori settings. Obviously, Montessori schools are not immune to this phenomenon, but they did have somewhat lower rates of racial discipline disproportionality than the traditional schools in this study. So why is that? What might be going on in these contexts that might provide some sort of mitigating or protective factors? Might it have something to do with multi-age classrooms and the fact that children and families are able to develop deep and multi-year relationships with teachers? Does the high level of individualization in the Montessori classroom lead to higher levels of engagement for children? Does the Montessori emphasis on autonomy and independence mean that teachers are spending less time micromanaging movements and behaviors of children? And does that provide some mitigating or protective factors? We don't know, right? We need additional study to determine if any of those propositions might be true, but none of those elements of Montessori practice that I just mentioned are or have to be unique to Montessori. Those are all practices that could be adopted in a wide variety of learning contexts. So answering these questions might give us some insight about how to address the problem. So very subtle graphic that I've chosen here to illustrate my point. Ultimately, as we consider the future of Montessori research, the thought I'd like to offer to you today is how can our work have the greatest impact? My belief is that making connections to the larger conversations that are already taking place within the education research world about racial justice will serve both to advance the cause of equity within the Montessori movement and to bring Montessori itself into those mainstream conversations. So that might look like asking questions like, how do race and special education intersect in Montessori schools? What does Montessori have to bring to the conversation about culturally responsive pedagogy? How does our philosophical orientation, how might we bring that to bear on this concept of culturally responsive teaching? What impact do public Montessori schools have on school segregation? How do English language learners experience Montessori classrooms? So I just would encourage us to be asking questions like these as we consider how our research agendas might advance racial justice both within and beyond Montessori. And lastly, I'm just going to throw my email up there. I know that our schedule today is quite tight and that we don't have a formal Q&A session right now, but I would encourage anyone with questions or thoughts or suggestions to reach out to me. Thank you.